Welcome back to Enigma of the Unknown, where we uncover the darkest mysteries and legends from all corners of the world. Tonight, we're diving into the spine-chilling stories of haunted snowmen from across New York State. From a snowman that mysteriously comes to life in Syracuse, to the cursed heart of darkness in Albany, and a terrifying encounter with a snowman in Brooklyn. These eerie tales will make you think twice about building that snowman next winter. So, grab your blankets and prepare yourself for a journey into the frozen unknown. Story number 1. The story of the snowman coming to life in Syracuse. In 2001, winter in Syracuse was so brutal that the entire city seemed to have descended into a kind of deathly stillness. The sun barely made an appearance during the day, and even then, its light couldn't chase away the gloomy sky. At night, temperatures dropped so fast that each breath seemed to freeze in one's lungs. A man named Harold Lang lived alone in a small, old house at the end of Glendale Road. He wasn't the type to be easily frightened. Harold had lived his whole life with the cold, with loneliness, and was used to fending for himself in a world that didn't much care. One night, when the snowfall was at its heaviest, Harold had a strange idea. Why not build a snowman? It was an odd thought, especially for a solitary, middle-aged man like him. But then, Harold thought, why not? The backyard was blanketed in pure white snow, and doing something outside might not be so bad. Harold put on his thick coat, warm gloves, and stepped out the back door. He started rolling clumps of snow into a large ball, packing it down tightly as he pushed it back and forth across the yard. Soon, he had 3 solid, round shapes stacked into the figure of a snowman, not too large but sturdy enough. To finish it off, he rummaged through his closet and found an old hat and a red scarf, adding 2 small stones for eyes. The snowman looked quite funny, with its tilted hat, slightly off-center eyes, and bright red scarf contrasting against the white snow. When he was done, Harold took a step back and admired his work. For a brief moment, he smiled, a rare smile he hadn't felt in a long time. He went back inside, feeling the warmth start to settle around him as he closed the door. The sun had begun to set, and the yard was quickly fading into darkness. Harold settled into an old armchair in his living room, sipping a hot cup of tea and feeling at ease. The snowman outside was just an inanimate figure, a small bit of fun on a quiet winter night. The next morning, when Harold woke up, he got out of bed and pulled back the curtains to let in the morning light. But as he looked outside, he froze. The snowman had turned. Its stony eyes were now facing the living room window, staring straight at him, as if it were watching his every move. Must have been a prank, Harold muttered, feeling a bit uneasy. Maybe some kids from the neighborhood had sneaked into his yard and turned the snowman. He reassured himself that he was just imagining things. But as he looked closer, Harold realized that the snow around the snowman was undisturbed. Everything was just as he had left it the night before. There were no footprints. Harold closed the curtains, trying to push aside the unsettling feeling gnawing at him. He threw himself into his daily routine, trying to ignore the thought. But all through the afternoon and evening, one odd question lingered in his mind. How had the snowman turned to face his window without anyone touching it? That night, Harold tried to sleep. Outside, snow continued to fall, creating a misty white veil over everything. But in the middle of the night, he suddenly woke up. There was a scratching sound, a soft, steady scratch, as if something were dragging along the ground. Coming from outside his window, Harold sat up, straining to listen, his heart pounding as fear began to settle over him. The scratching sound continued, rhythmic and unbroken, as if someone or something was moving through the snow. He crept over to the window and slowly pulled the curtain aside. There, in the dim light, he saw it. The snowman had moved again. It was now right up against his living room window, its black stone eyes staring straight at him, cold and expressionless, yet somehow alive. Harold stumbled back, his breath catching, his mind reeling. It was impossible. The snowman couldn't move on its own. But there it was, just outside his window, like a ghostly figure in the winter night. He couldn't tear his gaze away from the snowman's black eyes. They were empty, yet filled with a strange life, as though the figure outside was no longer an inanimate creation but a being with dark intent. Harold slammed the curtain shut, trying to banish the image from his mind. But that night, every time he closed his eyes, the snowman's dark, haunting eyes lingered in his mind, terrifying, chilling, and he found himself unable to sleep at all. Since that night, Harold had been unable to get a peaceful sleep. The image of the snowman standing right by his window, its pitch-black stone eyes staring back at him, haunted his mind relentlessly. He tried to convince himself that it was all just a trick of his imagination, perhaps the result of exhaustion or the bone-chilling cold of a harsh winter. But the haunting didn't fade. It clung to him like a layer of frost on the window, growing thicker each day, impossible to scrape away. Every night as darkness fell, Harold found himself sneaking glances out his living room window. There was a constant anxiety stirring inside him, as though a part of him knew that if he drew back the curtain, the snowman would be standing there. But all he ever saw was his empty backyard, pristine and peaceful beneath the faint glow of the streetlights. One night, just when Harold thought he might finally be rid of his haunting fear, a chilling scratching sound broke the silence. This time, the noise wasn't coming from the living room window but from the back door. Harold listened, his heart racing, and each sound seemed to creep under his skin. It was a long, steady scratching, like nails scraping on frozen ground, or the claws of some creature dragging against the icy glass. He tiptoed down to the kitchen, where the door led out to the backyard. Standing in the dark, he wondered if he should look outside, but a strange curiosity overwhelmed his fear. His fingers trembled as he reached for the latch and cracked the door open just enough to let in the biting cold. The porch light cast a pale glow over the snow, and for a moment, Harold froze. The snowman was standing barely 2 steps from the door. Its stone eyes weren't just lifeless rocks anymore. They gleamed with an eerie glint, as if reflecting light from some hidden source, a light from the depths of darkness. Harold's throat tightened, and he couldn't utter a sound. Those eyes were empty, yet they held an odd, chilling magnetism, an icy, haunting curiosity. Then, as if awakening from a trance, Harold noticed footprints leading from the snowman straight to his door. They were deep and irregular, as though the thing had dragged itself, step by step, toward him. His heart pounded. What was happening here? Was this snowman coming to life? Or had he become so obsessed that he was imagining it all? Quickly, he slammed the door shut and locked it. His hands shook as he stared into the darkness outside, trying to shake the image of the snowman from his mind. He retreated to the living room, heart still racing, and turned on every light in the house as if the brightness might drive away his fear. But the fear lingered. All night, he couldn't bring himself to close his eyes. Each time he tried, he saw those black stone eyes staring right back at him, endless and hollow, devoid of anything human or warm. The eyes of that snowman held only the cold, dead emptiness of the grave. After that night, Harold's nerves were frayed to the breaking point. He began to lose sleep, unable to eat, and every strange sound became amplified in the quiet house. The scratching at the door, the eerie swishing sound on the snow, and sometimes he thought he even heard faint whispers, as though someone were calling his name from within the cold, merciless wind. A week passed, and Harold was completely exhausted. Every night, he stationed himself by the window, always on guard. But the strange thing was, the snowman didn't appear every night. There were silent, still nights that almost felt normal. But just as he began to believe he'd imagined it all, the scratching sounds would start again, as if to remind him he was never truly alone. Harold couldn't find any explanation for what was happening. He tried calling friends to talk about it, but no one believed him. A snowman can't come to life. Harold, you're probably just stressed out. Get some rest. It'll all pass. But Harold knew what he was facing wasn't just a snowman. It was something darker, as though a spirit or a malevolent force had possessed that mound of snow, bringing with it a grudge from some far-off, shadowed realm. On yet another sleepless night, Harold sat on his old armchair, his eyes wide open, afraid to sleep, afraid to let down his guard. Outside, the snowfall was thick and heavy, blanketing everything, but suddenly, a chill ran down his spine. Silence had fallen. Everything was so quiet that he could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his chest. And then, in that dreadful silence, a faint whisper drifted through the air, soft but unmistakable. "Come outside. Harold." Harold froze, every cell in his body gripped by sheer terror. This wasn't the scratching, it was a voice, soft and gentle, yet utterly haunting. He didn't hear the scratching this time. Instead, there was a gentle, rhythmic tapping from the other side of the door. "Come outside." Harold shut his eyes tight, trying to block out the sound, but the voice echoed endlessly in his mind. When he finally opened his eyes again, he knew he had no choice. This snowman wasn't just a lifeless figure of snow. It was something that had returned from the grave, something that had existed here long before him, and it was relentless in its attempt to draw him outside. With trembling hands and a heart pounding with dread, Harold knew that his ordinary life was over. He feared this nightmare would never end, not as long as the snowman remained out there. Waiting, Harold could no longer distinguish between day and night. Everything had become a foggy blur, where he was nothing more than a walking corpse, surviving on fear and fitful nightmares. Every night, the knocking came from outside, the whispers growing increasingly intimate, like an eerie invitation drawing him closer to whatever awaited him in the darkness. But Harold could not leave this house. Though he wanted to escape, to scream, he no longer had the strength. He had become the prey of an invisible obsession, something that had gnawed away at him from within, draining his mind and spirit. He was no longer himself, but a man consumed by the image of the snowman outside, its lifeless eyes full of strange vitality, like a demonic creature peering into his very soul. On the final night of winter, Harold knew something was about to happen. A sudden snowstorm swept in, ravaging everything in its path. The snow fell thick and fast, so cold that his windows froze over, blocking out any light from outside. Harold sat in the darkness, the weak light of a desk lamp his only companion. Felt as though the house was shrinking, suffocated by the cold and the darkness, as if it were sinking into another dimension, where only he and that thing existed. And then, the knock came loud, insistent, and stronger than ever. This time, the knock came from the front door. Harold could not resist the compulsion. His legs moved as if controlled by something else, his body walking toward the door while his mind screamed for him to stop. The door swung open, and there, amidst the thick snow, the snowman was waiting. It was no longer a mere snow figure. It had become something from the realm of the dead. His jet-black stone eyes stared at him, deep and endless, like a black hole ready to swallow his soul. The red scarf fluttered in the wind, a symbol of blood and life. Harold froze, unable to move or scream. The snowman's eyes burned into his mind, pulling him into a never-ending nightmare. In that gaze, he saw himself being dragged into another world, standing alone in a vast, empty snowfield, cold and desolate, with no escape. The snowman's eyes were not just stones. They were alive, filled with memories, with souls, and Harold realized they were the souls of those it had cursed before. He tried to break free from that gaze, but the snowman had come too close, its icy snow hand reaching out like skeletal fingers, sharp and freezing. Harold wanted to scream, to step back, but his body was frozen. In that moment, he realized a horrifying truth. This snowman was not just a figure. It was a being, a ghost of winter, something from the darkness that had existed here long before him. The snowman lowered its face close to his, and Harold felt the cold of its snow lips. an icy chill that pierced deeper than anything he had ever known. It whispered into his ear, a voice that belonged to no creature he had ever encountered. "You will never escape me." Then, in an instant, darkness consumed everything. When Harold opened his eyes, he found himself lying in his house, his limbs numb, as though waking from a terrible dream. But he knew it was not a dream. He could feel the cold sinking into his bones, as though the chill of the snowman had seeped into his very soul. The next morning, the snowman had melted. All that remained was a dark, murky puddle and a few indistinct footprints in the snow. But Harold could not forget its gaze. Those eyes, haunting and unrelenting, seemed to be burned into his mind forever. He could not stay in the house for another minute. Gathering everything he had left, he packed his things and left, hoping to escape it all. But no matter where he went, he still felt watched. In his restless sleep, in every cold winter, the image of the snowman returned, its black, empty eyes staring into him from some distant world. And the next winter, Harold heard news of an old neighbor. They said someone had spotted a snowman standing in front of his house, his black stone eyes staring, the red scarf fluttering in the snow. Story number 2. The snowman's name in Hudson Valley. The Hudson Valley at Christmas in 1998 was truly beautiful, and Sam and Ellie had decided to spend the holiday in what they thought was the perfect place, a small house nestled quietly by the river, far away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The streets filled with Christmas lights and passing cars were no longer part of the life they sought. Here, there were only rolling hills, vast forests, and the biting cold of winter. "We're going to build a really nice snowman, right?" Ellie said, her eyes lighting up like tiny candles in the dark. Sam looked out the window, where snow had started to fall, covering the tree branches like soft white blankets, draping over the forest behind the house. There was something about the pure white light of winter that made him feel at peace, as if this was the only place in the world where they could start over. He nodded, offering a soft smile. "Of course, Ellie," he replied, "a beautiful snowman." That evening, after dinner, Sam and Ellie bundled up in thick coats and went outside to begin building their snowman. The snow had fallen thicker, forming smooth piles of snow that they could easily shape into round balls. Ellie placed 2 black stones for eyes, carrot for a nose, and an old hat of Sam's that he had found in the closet. They finished shaping the snowman under the dim glow of the streetlight, a silent figure standing in the dark. When they were done, the snowman stood tall, as if guarding the vast forest surrounding them. "It's a work of art," Ellie said, gazing at the snowman in awe. Sam just smiled, but when he looked back at the snowman, an uneasy feeling began to stir inside him. "Yeah, something's not quite right." He frowned, feeling as though the snowman was watching them, but he chalked it up to the darkness, to the fatigue of a long day. They stepped inside, closing the door behind them, leaving the snowman alone in the cold night outside. The first night, Sam and Ellie sat in the living room, curled up on the sofa, drinking wine and telling old Christmas stories. The atmosphere was warm, but outside, the snow kept falling, and the soft sounds of the wind blowing through the nearby branches played like a gentle lullaby. Both of them felt that this was the life they had dreamed of. Suddenly, a voice called out from outside the window, "Ellie, Sam, Ellie." Ellie jumped, looking toward the window. Sam paused in the middle of his story, his eyes drifting to the darkness outside, where the snowman stood, unmoving. "It's probably just the wind blowing through the branches," Sam said, trying to reassure his wife, though he couldn't explain why the voice sounded so clear. "That's not the wind," Ellie said, her voice trembling as her eyes remained fixed on the window. "Do you hear it? There's something out there. It's probably just your imagination." Sam stood up and walked over to the window, pulling back the curtains. But outside, there was only the wind blowing and the snow falling gently. The snowman was still there, standing motionless in the dark. Ellie didn't believe in strange things, but fear was rising in her. She turned back to Sam, her face anxious. "But, Sam, I can't explain it. We heard our names being called." Sam shrugged, trying to dismiss the unease. "It's just the wind, Ellie. There's nothing to worry about." But when he turned back to close the window, he had the distinct feeling that the snowman was watching them, not like a lifeless snow sculpture, but like a living creature, its dark eyes staring intently at them, as if it were waiting for something. That night, neither of them could sleep. The next day, Sam and Ellie decided to go outside and check on the snowman. But when they stepped onto the lawn, the snowman was gone. There were no traces left, only an untouched blanket of snow where the snowman had stood. They looked at each other, worry creeping into their hearts. "Did someone move it?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling with unease. Sam shook his head, feeling an indescribable fear rising within him. Who could move a large snowman like that without leaving a single trace? "Definitely not," he replied, but even he didn't believe his own words. And that was just the beginning, because the next night, as they sat in the living room, the voice called their names again, this time clearer and closer, as if coming from the very forest behind the house. "Sam, Ellie, Sam." Sam looked out the window. The snowman was no longer there, but the voice still echoed, and this time, it wasn't a coincidence. It was a desperate call, as if someone was standing in the darkness, waiting. "Ellie, Sam, come here." The lights in the house dimmed, and in the cold, silent night, they knew that something terrible was about to happen. Ellie no longer dared to step outside into the yard. The chill had seeped deep into every corner of her mind. Every night, the call echoed from the forest behind the house, a soft, alluring voice that also carried an undercurrent of threat she couldn't escape. "Ellie, Sam, Ellie." Each time she heard it, she felt as if someone were standing right behind her, breathing down her neck, even though she knew Sam was sitting beside her. "It's just someone playing tricks," Sam had said one night, his voice low and weary. "They just want to scare us." He tried to reassure her, but Ellie knew that something far worse was lurking, hiding in the shadows just outside the window, where the snowman had once stood tall. The darkness outside the window grew thicker with each passing night, stretching out like unseen ghosts waiting to swallow everything. They had once thought the sound was just the wind rustling through the branches, but it no longer felt like the wind. The call seemed to come from the shadows, from deep within the forest itself. Someone was calling their names. A week later, on a bitterly cold night, Sam decided he would go outside, despite the worry gnawing at him. He couldn't continue living in fear, couldn't let Ellie panic any longer. He knew he had to face whatever this was, even though he suspected that what he would discover might not be what he expected. "Are you coming with me?" Sam asked Ellie as he pulled on his thick coat. His voice faltered, and he didn't dare look her in the eyes. Ellie had seen something in his gaze, something she couldn't explain, a deeper fear than anything they had felt before. Ellie shook her head, clutching the pillow tightly. She couldn't go outside anymore. She couldn't face it. She just wanted to run, to bury herself under the blankets, close the window, and forget it all. "Stay here. I'll just check things out for a bit," Sam said, forcing a smile to reassure his wife. But even he wasn't sure he could face whatever waited out there. It wasn't the shadow of the snowman anymore. It wasn't just the cold of winter. It was the call. Sam stepped outside, leaving Ellie alone in the warm house. The snow still fell, blanketing the yard and garden. The night was pitch black, with no light except for the distant street lamp far at the end of the alley. Sam crossed the threshold and carefully locked the door behind him. His breath formed thin clouds in the freezing air as he stepped into the forest. His footsteps echoed strangely on the snow, as if something were following his every move. Every tree, every shadow seemed to twitch, ready to reach out and drag him into the darkness. First, Sam thought he was imagining it, but then the voice came again, louder and clearer than ever. "Sam, Sam, Ellie. Sam stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice wasn't coming from afar, it was close, right in front of him. He looked around, but all he could see were the black trees standing motionless like silent shadows, watching him in the dark. And then he saw the snowman. He stood there, in the same spot where he and Ellie had built it the night before. But tonight, it wasn't standing still. The branches of the trees around it seemed to bend, falling under the weight of something unseen pulling it out of the ground. The snowman's eyes, those black eyes, glowed in the dark. Sam felt as though he were being pulled in, like the snowman was staring into his mind, drawing him into a world from which there was no escape. He couldn't move. Those deep, black eyes seemed to peer into the depths of his soul, forcing him to stand still, forcing him to hear the call. Sam, come here. Ellie. He wanted to turn around, to run back to the house, but his body wouldn't obey. His feet were like lead, each step bringing him closer to the snowman, closer still, walking through the bone-chilling cold. Sam felt as though he was walking toward a deep hole, a place where the darkness would consume everything. His lips trembled as he felt something filthy, something dark, slithering out from the ground. And then, as he reached the snowman, he heard a deep, drawn-out sigh, a sigh that felt like some kind of monster had awakened in the darkness. Suddenly, Sam felt a strong force pushing him forward, as though someone were shoving him from behind, urging him toward the snowman. He tried to turn back, but his legs refused to cooperate. He wanted to scream, but the words caught in his throat. At that moment, he knew for certain this wasn't a joke. It wasn't the wind or some figment of his imagination. It was something real. As his eyes met the snowman's, he realized those weren't just ordinary black stones for eyes. They were glowing now, filled with a power so dark and cold, felt like death itself. And in that instant, Sam heard a faint sound, so small yet so clear, ringing in his mind. A call. Come here, Sam. Come here. Ellie. He no longer had the strength to resist. The cold was invading every muscle, every fiber of his being. His vision started to blur, and in the weak light of the distant stars, he knew he had stepped into another world, a world where the snowman, no longer a lifeless figure, but a terrifying creature, had called his name. In that moment, Sam knew there was no turning back. All he could do was move forward. Sam awoke in the dark. The night was pitch black, but it wasn't because the sky had grown darker than usual. It was the cold inside the house, a cold that the outside air couldn't compare to. It seemed to seep into every corner, creeping through the thick curtains, penetrating the walls, and drifting into the very cracks of his heart. Sam sat up in bed, dazed, looking around. Ellie, he called softly, but his voice sounded weak, raspy, as if something had sucked the breath right out of him. His head throbbed, heavy, as if someone had struck him hard. He raised his hand, but his fingers trembled, unable to grasp the bed's edge. Only the cold remained, like a haunting presence tightening around him. Sam got up and walked out of the bedroom. Everything around him seemed normal, but it was anything but. He entered the living room, and as the light from the table lamp illuminated the space, he saw Ellie sitting there, like a ghost, her eyes empty, staring through him as though she no longer recognized his presence. Ellie, Sam stammered, but she merely looked up, her vacant eyes fixed on him, as though searching for something behind it. Don't you see it? Ellie whispered, her voice echoing in the darkness, cold like the air outside. It's out there, the snowman. It's not a normal snowman. It's watching us. A chill ran down Sam's spine. He quickly moved toward the window, but when he looked outside, there was nothing. The familiar scene of the yard and the trees lay still beneath the thick snow. But he knew, deep down, that something terrible was waiting for them out there, waiting for the moment they stepped outside to continue the unfinished story. The smell of cold wasn't just winter's chill. It was something else, something that wasn't human, seeping into his mind, Sam turned back and saw Ellie standing there, her eyes still hazy, no longer sharp as they once were. "Ellie, are you okay?" She didn't answer. She only shook her head lightly, as if a part of her had been pulled away by something else. And then, the call came again. This time, it wasn't from the forest. It wasn't from the snowman. It came from their own shadow in the house. "Sam, Ellie, come here." The voice echoed again, soft but clear. But when Sam turned to look, he saw a tall figure standing in the corner of the room, a shadow of the snowman. But it wasn't the same one that he and Ellie had built the day before. Its eyes weren't just black. They were glowing, red like fire. A massive, grotesque grin spread across its snow-white face. Its mouth didn't close, and its eyes never left them, as if waiting for something terrible to happen. Sam flinched, but his feet wouldn't move. A cold hand touched his shoulder, but when he turned, no one was there. Only laughter echoed in his mind, as if the thing were mocking him, jeering at him. "Ellie, we have to go now." Sam panicked, grabbing his wife's hand, but she remained still, unblinking. "Don't you see? It's not a snowman anymore. It's something else." She finally tore her eyes away from the figure, but her gaze was no longer bright. Her eyes had dulled, as if the light in her life had faded. "It's out there, Sam," Ellie said, her voice low and hoarse, as though she was speaking from a place far away, a place Sam couldn't reach. He looked out the window. The night was dark and cold, but there was nothing. The snow still fell, but the dim light from the street lamp couldn't pierce the darkness that surrounded them. He could feel something in the air, something drawing closer, and then he heard footsteps. The footsteps weren't anyone else's. They were his own. They grew louder, step by step, slow and steady, not hurried. When he turned, he saw the snowman's shadow, now moving inside the house, walking slowly but surely, as if searching for something. "Ellie," he shouted, but not in fear. He called out to her, part of him wanting to pull her out of the trance, wanting her to see the truth. But as he got closer, he realized she was no longer Ellie. She wasn't his wife anymore. She was a puppet, a soulless shadow, standing still under the control of something invisible, as if the cold in the house was draining the very soul from her. "Ellie!" Sam screamed, rushing toward her. But when he touched her, Ellie collapsed to the floor, and at that moment, he heard a horrifying laugh, full of mockery and cruelty. The dark shadow stood there. "Ellie, Sam, you will be mine." At that moment, Sam could no longer run. The door to the house slammed shut behind him, and in the dark of Hudson Valley, the call still echoed, steady and unrelenting, like an invitation that couldn't be refused. Story number 3. The Snowman with a Black Heart in Albany. Christmas of 1988 arrived in Albany, New York, just as it had every year, blanketing the city with a thick, cold layer of snow. The snow fell silently, making the Thompson family's home even quieter and gloomier. Winters in Albany weren't something everyone could love. The cold, the biting air, not only numbed the bones but seemed to wrap the mind in strange thoughts, as if the chill didn't just seep into the body, but invaded the soul as well. But for the Thompson family, Christmas was a rare opportunity to feel warmth, not from the crackling fire in the hearth, but from the moments spent together. They had planned to build a large snowman in their yard, a tradition they kept alive every year, even if the snow and blizzards made it harder to find enough snow to shape it. Tommy, their only son, stood by the window, holding a mug of hot cocoa. His eyes followed the snowflakes swirling in the air, feeling the softness of the snow as it brushed against the glass. Christmas always brought a sense of wonder, despite the cold, despite the gray sky. But this year, something felt different. A strange sensation lingered, like someone was watching him. It felt as though invisible eyes were staring at the family from the yard. "Are you going outside, Tommy?" His mother, Ruth, called from the kitchen. "We need more snow to finish the snowman." Tommy nodded, though unease gnawed at him. He went outside, following his father, Joe, who had built the best snowman in the neighborhood for years. Joe was a strong, burly man, with rough hands from working hard labor. But every winter, he became an artist. The snowmen he made weren't just big piles of snow. They had eyes, noses, mouths, and details like red scarves and cowboy hats that made the neighborhood kids stop and stare. "We're going to make a really special snowman this year, Tommy," Joe said to his son, gripping a stick to pile the snow higher. "The tallest one on the block." Tommy smiled, but there was something that made him uneasy. As the Thompsons began to build the snowman, a strange feeling crept into Tommy's mind. He sensed an invisible presence in the air, something that didn't belong in this world. The atmosphere around the snowman seemed heavier, as if it wasn't just snow and materials that were being used to shape it. When the snowman was nearly finished, something odd appeared. A large black streak, like a faint mark, suddenly appeared under the snow, drawing a diagonal line from the snowman's belly up to its chest. Tommy caught a glimpse of the black streak just as the snowman's hat was placed on its head and the red scarf was wrapped around its neck. But the feeling he had when he looked at it was indescribable, a strange sense of unease. The black mark, shaped like a heart, seemed to haunt him, as if something was hiding within the snowman, waiting for the right moment to break free. When the family went inside, no one spoke of the black mark, though a part of them felt something was wrong. They continued to enjoy the warmth of their Christmas dinner. But Tommy couldn't shake the image of that black streak. He tried to pretend it hadn't happened, but deep down, a voice in his head kept whispering, "Look back at the snowman. Tommy, look back at it." As night fell, the Thompson family gathered around the dinner table, their laughter echoing in the warm room. But Tommy couldn't stop looking toward the window. The dark night outside seemed longer than usual, and the cold crept through the cracks, bringing a strange sense of loneliness. When everyone went to bed, Tommy couldn't sleep. He quietly crept over to the living room window, pulling the curtains back. The light from the porch lamp illuminated the snowman, making it look more strange than ever. The snowman's stone eyes were no longer lifeless. They seemed almost alive, as if they were watching him from a distance. He shuddered and turned away, but the feeling didn't leave him. He couldn't shake the thought that the snowman was smiling. Each night after that, the laughter grew clearer. A faint laugh echoed from the yard, while everyone in the house slept soundly. Tommy lay awake in his bed, his eyes wide open, unable to close them. He heard the steady sound of snow falling on the roof, but in the darkness, the laughter seemed to come from the snowman itself. He didn't tell his parents because he didn't want to worry them, but one night, unable to bear it any longer, Tommy got up and quietly walked over to the living room window. He pulled back the curtain, and when the light from the porch cast over the snowman, he saw it. The snowman was still there, but this time, it wasn't just standing still. Its mouth, which had previously been nothing but a snow line, now seemed to be curling into a smile. A chill ran down Tommy's spine. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. He could only stand there, staring into the snowman's stone eyes. And then a whisper came, soft but clear, as if from somewhere far away, drifting into the room. "Tommy, don't hide from me anymore. That Christmas, nothing was peaceful anymore." The winter of 1988 had become a nightmare from which the Thompson family could not wake. Time passed, but in their hearts, that Christmas still remained an unhealed wound. After the night Tommy had seen the strange smile on the snowman, something had changed in him. The cold, indescribable sensation, the feeling as if an invisible hand were caressing his skin, persisted, making him restless. At night, he no longer heard the faint laugh from the yard, but that feeling, the feeling of being watched by the snowman, lingered, relentless. A week passed, but the Thompsons never spoke of the snowman again. Joe, the father, was a practical man who never believed in strange stories or the supernatural. They lived in Albany, where snow was a given every winter, and a snowman was nothing special, just snow and the small joys of a holiday season. But for Tommy, everything had changed. One morning, while Tommy was eating breakfast, he saw the silhouette of the snowman through the window. The sun was high, and the snow still blanketed the yard, but there it was, standing there, right where it had always been, in the middle of the yard. But this time, what terrified Tommy wasn't the smile or the cold, lifeless stone eyes, it was the stillness. It was too still. The snowman no longer seemed like an inanimate object. It stood there like a living entity, a ghost that he couldn't explain. He shuddered and turned away, not daring to look any longer. Tommy knew he had to do something, but he couldn't tell his parents. Everything was too strange, too hard to believe. They wouldn't understand, but he couldn't ignore that feeling. The black streak shaped like a heart was still etched into his mind, and he couldn't erase it. On the next night, Tommy decided he would destroy the snowman. He couldn't bear it anymore. He had to know what was hiding inside, what the snowman was concealing. The fear within him grew stronger, as if some invisible force was pulling him toward it. It was no longer just the curiosity of a child. It was the compulsion of something darker, as if the black heart itself was calling to him. Tommy quietly crept down the stairs and out into the yard. The night sky was freezing, like steel, and there wasn't a sound to be heard. Snow fell like a thick mist, covering everything in sight. The silence was so absolute. It felt as if time itself had stopped. Tommy could feel a cold breath from the yard, deep and bone-chilling. He stepped closer to the snowman, as if entering another world, a space where darkness had already claimed dominion. When he got closer, Tommy stopped. The snowman stood there, motionless, but this time he didn't feel the same. It was like a shadow with life, with its own mind. He crouched down and began to dig around the snowman, his hands trembling, muttering prayers he didn't understand. But he couldn't stop. When his shovel hit something solid inside the snowman, Tommy felt a wave of cold pierce his heart, as though something stiff and long buried in the earth was awakening. He dug a little more, and then it revealed itself. The black mass. It wasn't snow, and it wasn't stone. It was as black as coal, shiny, and shaped like a heart. Tommy stared at it, and he felt the cold seeping through his hands, spreading throughout his body. It wasn't just a physical object. It felt like a living thing, a creature waiting to awaken. Tommy recoiled, and then a sense of guilt washed over him. He shouldn't have done that. He shouldn't have touched it. But when he looked back, the black mass had begun to move. The surrounding snow seemed to be drawn toward the black mass, swirling around it like invisible threads. The black heart began to expand, like a crack in space itself, a crack leading to an endless abyss. Tommy couldn't breathe, a strange and overwhelming fear rising in him. He ran back toward the house, his feet heavy, as though someone was pushing him down. But when he glanced back at the snowman, its stone eyes were staring directly at him. That look no longer lifeless, but knowing. In that moment, the eyes seemed to understand exactly what he had done. Tommy bolted into the house, slammed the door shut, and gasped for breath. His mind was spinning. He could hear the wind howling outside the window, but there was something strange about it. The wind didn't sound like snowstorm wind anymore. It sounded like something was whispering, an eerie sound he couldn't comprehend. The next morning, when his parents went outside to check, they found the snowman was gone, but the traces of the black mass remained. A long, black streak, like an imprint in the snow, led toward the corner of the yard, where there was nothing but darkness. Joe and Ruth looked at each other, confused, not understanding what had happened. But Tommy knew. He knew better than anyone, and he could never forget the bone-chilling feeling when he looked into that black heart. Something had awoken, and it would never sleep again. The cold of Albany's winter had begun to become unbearable for the Thompson family. When Joe and Ruth decided to search for the snowman in the yard the next morning, all they found was an eerie silence. There was no sign of the snowman or the black heart-shaped mass. Their yard appeared as if nothing had happened, like it had all been a dream, an illusion born from a snowstorm's night. But Tommy could no longer deceive himself. He felt something dark was lurking, like an unseen ghost hiding in the shadows outside in the yard. That feeling of waiting clung to him, tormenting him every time he looked toward the yard, where the snowman had once stood. That day, Tommy sat in his room, his eyes glued to the window. He couldn't shake the strange thought that the snowman was no mere pile of snow. The black heart inside the snowman, it wasn't part of nature. It seemed like a sign, a warning from some unseen force. Tommy tried not to think about it, but every time night fell, he couldn't sleep. Strange sounds echoed in his mind, the faint laugh, the whispers from outside the window, from the yard. It was like a reminder that something was unfinished. On a night when snow fell heavily, while the entire family slept, Tommy heard a soft noise outside the window. He sat up, his body stiff with fear. His mind was foggy, but the cold sensation and the unshakable fear gripped him. He knew, almost instinctively, that the snowman had returned. He quietly crept down the stairs, careful not to make a sound. His heart pounded in his chest. The door to the yard looked like a dark gateway to hell. But Tommy couldn't stop. He had to know, had to understand what was happening. When he opened the door to the yard, the cold wind of the snowstorm slapped him in the face, like an invisible hand. The yard was swallowed in darkness, the only light coming from the outside lamp, casting a faint, blurry shadow. And then he saw it, the snowman, but not the same snowman as before. He stood there, but no longer as an inanimate figure of snow. The black heart-shaped mass that Tommy had seen before now began to emerge from within the snowman. It was no longer just a dark streak. It was a mass, a black mass that seemed to ooze something wet and slimy. It was like a massive crack, something rising up from the frozen earth. Tommy felt like he could no longer breathe. That feeling again, the feeling as if invisible eyes were staring at him. Even though he couldn't see anyone, that black mass, that black heart, now seemed alive, breathing, opening up to welcome him. And then, Tommy heard a whisper. "Tommy, you can't run. No one can run." The voice wasn't from anyone inside the house. It came from the black mass in the snowman, from something he couldn't explain. He couldn't move, his body frozen as if it had been encased in ice. The black mass began to expand like a wide, gaping mouth, like a shadow consuming all the air around it. The cold wind cut through him. Tommy felt his hands freeze, but he couldn't turn away. He couldn't leave. At that moment, another figure stepped out of the darkness. Mrs. Wilson, the faint shadow of the old woman from the village, appeared through the snow, walking toward the snowman. She didn't look at Tommy, but her eyes locked onto the black mass, the black heart. Mrs. Wilson had a strange appearance, with cloudy eyes and silver hair, as if she had lived too long in this village, witnessing too many strange things. She looked up at Tommy, her voice raspy, like it came from the very bottom of a deep abyss. "This snowman, it's not something you can understand. Boy, it's not a game, not just a snow figure like all the others. This is the snow soul, and the black heart inside it is our life and our death." Tommy couldn't speak. His eyes widened, staring at Mrs. Wilson like a wild animal about to be caught. Mrs. Wilson turned away, walking toward the snowman. With each step she took, she grew farther away, until she was nothing more than a shadow in the thickening snowstorm. Tommy stood there, unable to move, unable to understand what was happening. But one thing he knew for sure, this thing, the snowman, was not just a ghost story. It was something bigger, darker, and it was waiting. When Mrs. Wilson disappeared into the snowstorm, Tommy heard a faint sigh from the direction of the snowman. The black heart-shaped mass was drawing in the light, as if it were consuming the space around it. Tommy could no longer bear it. "Run!" A voice screamed in his mind. He turned and ran back toward the house. But when he slammed the door behind him, He couldn't forget the feeling the snowman had left in his heart. It wasn't just a shadow in the snow. It was a curse, and his whole family could never escape it. Story number 4. Snowman under streetlights in Brooklyn. Aline had always loved winter nights, especially during Christmas. After a long day working at a cafe in Brooklyn, as the city shifted into night and was covered in a blanket of pure white snow, she felt like she was a part of some story, where streetlights cast dim glows and darkness crept into every corner. But tonight, the light from the street lamps wasn't warm enough to chase away the strange feeling inside her. It was a night bitterly cold, the winter of 2003, a Christmas like no other. Aline had just gone through an abrupt breakup, a marriage that never had the chance to end in argument or reconciliation. And now, here she was, walking alone on the quiet streets of Brooklyn, where everything was still, only the crunch of her boots on the thick snow breaking the silence. She passed old buildings, peering into windows lit from within, where families gathered together, happy. But she only had her lonely footsteps, her wandering thoughts. She gave a weak smile. Was it so easy for people to become lost like this? Alone, silently, unseen by anyone. But then, the streetlight ahead caught her attention. Faint turn, something lurking beneath the light. She stopped briefly, took a deep breath, and looked forward. The snowman. She wasn't sure why the snowman drew her in. Maybe it was because of its perfect appearance, or maybe it was simply the way it stood silently under the streetlight, like a stone statue frozen in time. The pure white snow, the dry snowballs stacked neatly, creating the shape of a giant snowman, a pointed cone hat on its head, 2 round eyes like light bulbs, its mouth stretched wide in an odd manner, as if screaming into the darkness. She frowned. Must be some prank, Aline told herself, not wanting to think too much about it. Snowmen were nothing new in this neighborhood. They were just the playful creations of children during the holiday season. But there was something off about this one. The light from the street lamp cast a faint glow on the snowman's face, making its eyes, those strange eyes, seem to glow in the darkness. A red light, fiery red. Aline wasn't sure if she was seeing things, but those eyes, they were unlike any snowman eyes she'd ever seen. There was something too real about them, too alive, and the mouth, stretched open, almost like a smile, but more like a call from the depths. She started walking again, not wanting to pay any more attention to a strange prank. After all, this was Brooklyn. Wasn't this supposed to be a Merry Christmas? But then, a sound broke the silence. The sound of footsteps. Slowly, Aline froze. She could clearly hear each step. Footsteps that weren't her own. It wasn't the sound of her boots crunching in the snow. No, she turned around, her eyes adjusting to the dim light, searching for the figure behind her. First, there was silence. Then, she saw it. The snowman had moved. It wasn't a normal movement, like some snow game or a gentle breeze shifting the snow. No, the snowman had actually moved closer to her, and the light from the street lamp grew weaker. It stood there, in the shadows, but its red eyes were now glowing even brighter. They seemed to be watching her. No, not just watching, they were looking right through her. Aline's heart raced in her chest. She felt a chill run through her, an invisible fear sweeping over her like a cold wave. Her hair stood on end. This wasn't the same snowman she'd seen earlier. No, something inside it. Something deep within the snowman. Like a ghost, a lost soul, was waiting. Don't look back, she told herself, as if by not looking, by not acknowledging it, it would disappear, and everything would return to normal. But that wasn't the case. She heard the footsteps again. The sound, steady, slow, drawing nearer. Aline swallowed hard. She started walking faster, but the sound followed her. With every step, the shadow grew closer. Then, a strange voice echoed in her mind. Not a real sound, but a whisper, soft as the breath of the wind. Don't run. She turned around once again, unable to resist, and this time, The light from the street lamp revealed something she had never imagined. The snowman wasn't standing still like before. It had moved closer, very close now. Its red eyes weren't just glowing. They were alive, ominous. Its mouth was wide open, but it wasn't a cheerful smile like she thought. No, it was more like a mouth screaming, calling out, but without a sound. Eileen turned and ran. She couldn't bear to look back, only knowing her legs were moving faster and faster, as if her heart was about to burst from her chest. But the footsteps didn't stop, kept chasing her, never letting her go. Eileen couldn't sleep. The strange feeling still clung to her, like a shadow she couldn't shake off. She sat motionless on the fabric-covered chair, holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold, her eyes fixed on the foggy window. Outside, Brooklyn was swallowed by the thick night, snow still falling, quietly, as if it would never stop. But after all, this was Christmas night, and a part of her told her that everything would be okay. The night couldn't last forever, and tonight, everything would go back to the way it was. Still, she couldn't erase the image of the snowman from her mind. It wasn't its comical shape, nor the bright red eyes, but the feeling that it wasn't really a snowman. It was definitely not. Something had moved in that darkness, something in that quiet street, where every light had slowly faded, had followed her. It must have been my imagination, she told herself. But the words felt like a lie she was telling herself. She set the cup down, her hands trembling. Her footsteps were hurried, growing faster with each passing moment. Eileen couldn't stay here any longer. She had to go out. She had to do something to prove that the feeling was just a figment of an overactive mind, a result of the tense late-night nerves. But no, even as she stepped outside, with the biting cold air rushing into her body, she still couldn't forget those glowing red eyes, the coldness they brought with them, like an invisible hand reaching out from the dark. So, she decided to walk down the narrow street that led to the park, where the streetlights still flickered weakly, but all was drowned in an eerie darkness. The dim light seemed incapable of warming the quiet spaces around her. She didn't know why she was returning to this street, the one where the snowman had stood the night before, staring at her. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was fear. Fear that she wouldn't be able to shake the feeling of being watched unless she confronted it directly. She walked on, even though unease weighed heavily in her chest. The thick air of this dark night made her feel as though something was lurking, watching her from around every corner. When she stopped beneath the streetlight, right where the snowman had been the night before, Eileen couldn't help but shudder. No one was there, only the light from the street lamp reflecting off the snow-covered ground. The streets disappearing beneath a thick white blanket. Everything was silent, so silent that her fear could have burst wide open. But there was something strange, a dark streak, as if something had moved through here recently. Eileen looked up, gasping, the feeling of invisible eyes boring into her from the darkness. She took a step back, then another. Suddenly, she realized there was someone standing there, not the snowman, but a shadowy figure, something undefined. She could feel its presence in the space around her, though she couldn't make out its shape. A sudden cold wind blew, making Eileen's hair flutter, and then she heard it, a whisper, so faint that she had to stop to catch it. "Don't go. Don't leave." The voice wasn't from anyone in the park, not from anyone on the street. No, this voice seemed to come from the very air around her. A strange voice, full of power, yet filled with desperation, as if calling out to her. Eileen felt her skin tingle. She turned around to look, but saw no one. "You can't escape." The voice continued to whisper. "We can't escape." She exhaled sharply, telling herself she was just imagining things. But the truth was, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling. The sensation was like an invisible force tightening around her throat, like a rope being pulled tighter in the dark. She had to leave. She had to go back home. She had to do something to get rid of this feeling. And just as she turned to leave, as her footsteps crunched on the snow, she felt it again, Something was watching her. The sound returned, the footsteps, slow, steady, coming from behind. Eileen turned around once more, her heart pounding in her chest. The snowman. This wasn't the rigid snowman she had seen the night before. This was a living creature, as if the snow itself had turned into a conscious body. The shape stood silently beneath the streetlight, but this time, its mouth was no longer just a crack. It seemed to open, not just wide, but as if it were sucking in the air, like a gaping black hole. And the eyes, those eyes, the red ones, the light, red as blood, like the glow of a flame that never extinguished. Eileen couldn't stand there any longer. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the snow, not daring to look back, not daring to think about anything. She only knew that if she didn't run, if she didn't escape, that thing would swallow her up. The thing in the dark would pull her in, and the footsteps kept following her, steady, relentless, a reminder that there was no safe place to run. Eileen couldn't look back. With every step she took in the snow, the cold wind blowing through her made her shiver. But it wasn't from the cold. No, the chill was just an excuse. What she feared wasn't the winter frost, but the sensation of something behind her, something watching every step she took in the dark, as if a pair of glowing red eyes were still shining, still trying to pull her back. She dared not turn her head. Each time her foot stumbled in the thick snow, felt like she might fall, as if those eyes were chasing her, pulling her from behind. It wasn't just an invisible shadow in the night. It was an entity, a being that had lived and waited in the freezing darkness for a long time. She ran, but her steps couldn't outrun the strange feeling that clung to her. She could hear the steady footsteps behind her, as though the snowman was following her, step by step, never rushing but never retreating. She tried to quicken her pace, her heart pounding in her chest, as if it would burst. But those footsteps, their rhythm never faltered, seemed to be drawing her back. When she was almost home, a gust of wind suddenly cut through the air, cold as a blade. She screamed not from pain, but from sheer panic. Just one more second, and she would be out of the neighborhood, out of the reach of these empty streets. But then she heard it, a sound, a whispering voice that echoed in her head, like a warning, an irresistible call. Don't go home. The voice wasn't anyone else's. It was from the very shadow that had been chasing her. Eileen couldn't breathe. She looked ahead, where her small house loomed, barely visible in the dark. The streetlights scattered, their light unable to pierce the darkness that filled her chest. Her heart felt heavy. Something wasn't right here. It was as if the house itself, with its dark windows, was waiting for her, waiting to swallow her whole, just like the snowman's gaping mouth. She rushed to open the door, darting inside without looking back, without even glancing at the street. But as soon as the door slammed shut, a heavy, oppressive feeling surrounded her. Everything seemed to freeze in the air, as if the space in the room was tightening around her. Eileen couldn't stop gasping for breath. Her heart pounded so loudly that she could feel each beat in her ears. She looked around. In the thick darkness of the room, the lights were still on. The door was still tightly shut. But why did she feel like there was someone here? In this very house? This strange, suffocating sensation had followed her from the street into this place. And now it refused to let her go. She opened the living room window, sticking her head outside, trying to get some fresh air. But there was nothing in the space beyond, just the darkness, the falling snow, and a terrible silence. Only darkness. Suddenly, she heard a sound. That whispering voice, the same voice, rang in her head again. It wasn't the voice of a human. It wasn't a normal sound. It was something else. The voice flooded her mind, like a terrible warning that she couldn't ignore. There's no escaping. You can't escape from it. She turned around, but saw no one in the room. Just darkness. Just empty chairs and cold walls. Everything was as usual, but something was weighing down on her heart. Then, once again, the footsteps came. Slow, steady, deliberate, not from the door, but from inside the house. Aline stood frozen, her heart missing a beat. She heard the footsteps, coming from the hallway, from behind the wall. These weren't her footsteps, and they weren't anyone else's. There's no one else. She heard the words clearly, not from outside, but from within the room itself. The words, cold and lifeless, felt like a curse that couldn't be erased. The cold in the house grew sharper. The air thickened, viscous like oil, making it hard for Aileen to breathe. She turned to look down the dark hallway, where shadows flickered. No, she couldn't stay here any longer. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to leave the house. She had to run. But as she walked toward the door, she noticed something strange. The door was locked, as if someone had closed it from the outside. And then she heard the laughter. It wasn't the laugh of a person. It wasn't the laugh of a human being. No, it was a terrible sound, like something was rejoicing, victorious, preparing to swallow her into the darkness. She turned around and looked, and in that darkness, at the end of the hallway, she saw a shape, the Snowman, not outside, not under the streetlight. It was standing right there in the house, and its red eyes, glowing in the dark, were staring directly at her, as if it had known she would come. She couldn't breathe anymore. She couldn't move. The cold had arrived, and it was swallowing everything. Thank you for joining us on this icy journey into New York's haunted winter tales. These stories of snowmen with glowing eyes, eerie movements, and chilling presences remind us that even the most innocent figures can hold a sinister secret. If you enjoyed tonight's stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to uncover more mysteries and hauntings in future episodes. Until next time, stay warm, stay safe, and keep an eye on those snowmen outside your window. You never know what might be watching you back.